Hello everyone, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum here in Morristown, Tennessee. And we want to welcome you to the first of a series of episodes in honor of the month of February. Now before we dive into all of that, I just want to ask you on Facebook and YouTube to please be praying for me, because about a week ago to the day I tripped or stumbled, something like that, and slammed headfirst into a door. Now, after about a day of acting funnier than I normally do, my wife, she had me taken to the hospital, wherein they did diagnose me with a minor concussion. However, I will say that it could have been a lot worse. Thankfully, it was just that. I know those are nothing to play with. The symptoms are still there, but they're nowhere near as bad as what they were earlier in the week. So that means I am making a recovery. I just want y'all out there to be praying for me that I do make a full recovery. But if you're out there wondering, why in the world are you doing this video when you should be home resting? Well, then you don't know me by now, because I am a glutton for punishment, I am a slave to appearances, and I also have a penchant for trying to take things to the nth degree to entertain and educate the public. And that's exactly what's going to be happening here today. So like it or love it, be worried about me or not, either way we're going to press on with this video. So, as previously mentioned, this episode is the first of a series of episodes for the month of February, in which we will be discussing the story of a man whose life and legacy was so incredible that he would later go on to inspire stories and tales as tall as he was. And in fact, the impact he left upon his nation and its history would span generations and captivate and inspire audiences even to this day. So come along with me as we begin the story of this man with the first chapter, The Old Fox is Born. Now, the man who would later become known as the father of his country was born on February 22nd, 1732 at Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was born to Augustine and Mary Ball Washington, the first of 6 children that they would have together. His father, however, was not only a justice of the peace and a prominent figure, but he also had 4 other children from his previous marriage to Jane Butler. Young George Washington was not very close to his father, and in fact rarely mentioned him in later years. He also had a fractious relationship with his mother. And if you actually study the life of young Washington, we see that the best relationship he had out of all of his family, including siblings, was to his older half-brother, Lawrence. But despite that, we see that from Pope's Creek, where Washington was born, they moved to Little Hunting Creek in 1735, and then from there to Ferry Farm in 1738 near Fredericksburg, Virginia. It was there that Augustine passed away in 1743 and left Washington as the sole inheritor of Ferry Farm as well as 10 slaves. Lawrence, on the other hand, received the lands along Little Hunting Creek, which he later renamed Mount Vernon. Now, George Washington and Lawrence, they got along fairly well, but the one disparity between the two of them is that due to his father's passing, George Washington never received the proper formal education that he would have desired to have growing up, because his elder half-brothers had actually went to Appleby Grammar School in England, whereas there was nothing for George Washington to do except attend Little Church School in Hartfield. It was there that he learned how to read, write, do mathematics, and he also became a very proficient writer and a map maker in and of his own right. In later years, especially in his early adulthood, as later historians would put it, he would write with such considerable force and precision, whether it be for writing in his journal or certain legal documents, or in this one particular book that he wrote, which was titled The Rules of Civility. It was basically a manifesto on how to behave in polite society, and gained its inspiration from the English translation of a French manuscript along the same lines. We also see that at this time George Washington was prone to visit the Belvoir plantation, which was the plantation of William Fairfax, Lawrence's father-in-law. Of course, Washington also visited Mount Vernon, and as we all know, he would later live there. But we'll talk about that here in just a second. But what we do see is that William Fairfax became a patron and a surrogate father to George Washington, and encouraged and inspired him to pursue activities and a career in map-making and surveying, which he did to a certain degree. And in fact, he took a expedition to explore and survey all of William Fairfax's Shenandoah Valley property. And he must have done a pretty good job of it, because Thomas Fairfax, William's cousin, actually appointed, without Washington having to have served the customary period of apprenticeship, he appointed Washington as the surveyor of Culpeper County in Virginia. Now, if you think he was not exactly qualified and didn't have the actual paperwork to prove that he was qualified, well, you'd be dead wrong, because prior to this appointment, Washington did actually receive his license as a surveyor from the College of William and Mary. From there, of course, as I said, he was appointed the surveyor of Culpeper County, and he took that oath of office on July 20th, 1749, but for whatever reason resigned that office in 1750. Either way, we see that by the year of 1752, Washington himself owned about 1,500 acres in the Shenandoah Valley and owned as a whole around 2,315 acres. But prior to the year of 1752 and 1751, George Washington, for the first and only time, actually left North America on a trip to Barbados with his half-brother Lawrence, and they did so in an attempt to seek a cure for his brother's tuberculosis. They hoped that the warmer climates would get rid of that tuberculosis, and this was a very common thought process at the time. While along the trip, George Washington himself contracted smallpox, which left his face slightly scarred for the rest of his life. Lawrence, however, unfortunately died in 1752, and Washington afterwards leased Mount Vernon from Lawrence's widow, Anne, only to then inherit it outright from the family when Anne passed away in 1761. But prior to his passing, Lawrence had served as an adjutant general in the Virginia militia, and this inspired a young George Washington to seek a militia commission himself. And considering his bearing and possibly a bit of being nobility of the land at that time, the lieutenant governor of Virginia at the time, Robert Dinwiddie, gave Washington a commission in the Virginia militia. And in the year of 1753, he sent Washington on a diplomatic mission, if you will, because at the time, the British and French were kind of coming to a head with contested claims on territories, particularly in the Ohio River Valley. You see, at that time, the British, they were building and constructing forts along the main rivers in that area, and the French were constructing forts between the rivers and Lake Erie. So in 1753, Robert Dinwiddie, he encouraged Washington, sent him as a special envoy to actually go up to the Ohio River Valley with demands, diplomatically of course, that the French leave the lands that were contested and claimed by the British. Along the way, he also encouraged Washington to make peace with the Iroquois Confederacy and seek out from them what information he could as to the strength of the French forces. Well, Washington set out along his journey and finally arrived at Logstown, where he met the leader of the Iroquois, Tenochtitlán. And it was there that Washington noted something a little peculiar, possibly flattering, and that was that Tenochtitlán gave him the name Conaticarius, which basically translates to the devourer of villages. And interestingly enough, this is a nickname that was given to his great-grandfather, John Washington, in the late 17th century by the Susquehannock people. But as we progress further, Washington had left the Iroquois nation and continued along to the forks of the Ohio, wherein in November of 1753, he and his envoy were captured by the French and sent to Fort Le Boeuf. There, Washington and his men were treated very well and very cordially, and they were given wine and hot food and clothes and things like that, and all hospitalities were presented to them. However, Washington was there on a mission, and when that mission was made known, essentially ordering the French to leave, the wishes of which he made known to the French commander of the fort, Legardeur de Saint-Pierre, well, needless to say, they declined. And Saint-Pierre ended up delaying his answer for a little bit, not because he was conflicted, because he was not about to negotiate with the British. He felt that the French had as much of a claim to the land as the British did, if not better. But what he was doing was playing the part of a perfect gentleman, a factor that featured heavily in warfare of that time period. And so he gave them all the hospitality he could, and before he sent them back from Fort Le Boeuf to Virginia, he actually gave them ample supplies and provisions, as well as clothing. But this journey back to Virginia was in the winter of 1753 to 1754, and needless to say, Washington and his men had to endure very harsh conditions along the trail. And because of that, it was actually almost miraculous, if you will, that Washington's envoy made it back unscathed to Virginia. And so Washington received a bit of fame and notoriety for having handled himself and conducted himself that well on such a mission in such conditions, especially when the report was made public in Virginia and London. But in February of 1754, Governor Dinwiddie yet again made another appointment for George Washington, and that was he would be placed in charge of the 300-strong Virginia Regiment, and he ordered him to take that regiment up to the forks of the Ohio and force the French out. Well, in April of 1754, Washington left the forks of the Ohio with about half that force. Little did he know, though, that as he made his way back to the lands he had just come from, he was embarking upon a path that would give him the fame and notoriety that he had so long desired to achieve, and in fact would lead him into lighting the fuse to ignite the powder keg that would set off what would later become known as the War That Made America. Well, folks, this concludes today's episode, and we want to thank you so much for coming along. As always, we appreciate your support on Facebook and YouTube. It is greatly appreciated. If you haven't already, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and also be sure to click the little ding-dong bell, that bell icon, so you'll never miss an upload. But I've already taken enough time out of your day, and I'm going to go ahead and get out of your hair. So until next week, this is Isaac White signing off from the Crockett Tavern Museum, saying goodbye and God bless.